Let's get started. I've started with a very easy one, but sorry, I've started with a very easy picture, but before that I wanted to point out that what people often struggle with when they see a butterfly is that they look at it and they remember the vague colour, so they say it was blue, but that's not enough. What you really want to look at, as it says here, is the wing edges. Some of the summer species you need to look inside the wing edge at the detail, but usually the wing edges are a really good place to start with identification. So as it says at the bottom there in smaller print, if you note the basic ground colour to get a clue, and then the wing edges, and then perhaps at eye spots further in, and that's going to be really helpful. The butterfly's size is not crucial, but it's helpful, and the actions are really helpful, because what a butterfly does gives you a lot of information about the family it belongs to and whether it's a male or a female, and quite a few butterfly species have males and females of different colours. And then of course the location, garden, yes, but it could be that your garden is in North Oxfordshire or South Oxfordshire or some other county, and that makes a difference. And the time of year, well, we're looking today at butterflies you're going to see in June in your garden, I think. I can't be 100% certain that you won't see something else, but these are the ones that are most likely. And then you'll notice that butterflies that chase other butterflies and various other bits and pieces are usually male. Very rare for a female to chase another butterfly. And butterflies that usually spend their time around plants. I don't mean nectaring on flowers, but testing the leaves of the plant to see what they are. That's usually a female, which can be a very helpful thing to know. Okay, let's start with some easy ones. And I'm hoping no one's going to be asking me how you can tell a peacock, because those four really bright eyes should make it pretty straightforward, I think. So we'll assume that peacock's easy and move on. Red Admiral and Painted Lady. These species have in common the wing tip pattern. And if you look at the wing tips, the four wing tips, here the Red Admiral and here the Painted Lady have the same black tip with a little ring of white dots. And this is because they're very closely related, but this is also really helpful. There are only these two species of all the UK butterflies with this pattern in the wing tip here. So if you see a vaguely orangey pink butterfly with this pattern, it's a Painted Lady, and if it's a mostly black butterfly with red, occasionally orange here, then it's obviously a Red Admiral. And people do sometimes struggle with Painted Lady thinking it's a fritillary, which are very scarce in gardens, whereas Painted Ladies are commoner. But if you can see this wingtip, then you know it isn't a fritillary. The undersides of the two species show exactly the same wingtip pattern look. The white dots and the black, sorry, on a dark background in both species, pretty much identical to the way it looks on the top surface. And if you on the side, I think it's all these little eyes on the Painted Lady here that are probably an absolute clincher. You can just tell usually from the fact the Red Admiral is so much darker, but that is an absolute sure sign, these eye spots on the Painted Lady. Okay. Now, the Painted Lady could, if you didn't know about the wingtips, could be confused with comma or small tortoiseshell, but you'll notice the comma, which has this stripy effect here on the leading edge of the forewing, rather like the small tortoiseshell, is far less contrasty. So this is quite a dark orange colour with black marks and some slightly paler yellow towards the leading edge. The small tortoiseshell is black on a brighter orange, less dark, and really obvious white and very pale stripes here. In addition, if you look at the hind wing edge, once again edges are important, here you see yellow lunules. We call these little marks lunules, little triangles. And on the small tortoiseshell, blue. And the small tortoiseshell is the only UK species with blue around that hind margin. And on many small tortoiseshells, you'll see it on the forewings as well, but it isn't always quite so obvious on the forewings, especially as these butterflies get worn. So we can tell them apart. We've got the wingtips, painted lady, the less contrasty and yellow lunules on the comma, plus the fact that its shape is so strange. And the small tortoiseshell, more contrasty, definitely very contrasty in this area, and blue around the edges. One species which is in the same family but a distant relative that could be confused with them is speckled wood. Sometimes people are not sure if a speckled wood is perhaps a comma or a tortoiseshell, but please note it isn't orange. This ground colour is a really dark chocolate brown, really dark, with yellow spots, lots of them, and look at the eye spots. So instead, like the comma of having yellow lunules, it's got big pale dots with black and white pupilled eye spots. Quite different. And I've put the underside here to show that the same patterning shows through on the underside. You'll be able to read all these bits, which I'm not bothering to read out when you look at the video if you wish. Okay, now the undersides are definitely trickier. If you see the butterfly with its wings closed, especially if it's roosting or hibernating, because you could find the first three anyway, hibernating, the comma, the tortoiseshell and the peacock hibernate, and the forewing then closes behind the hind wing. But apart from the outline, very wavy here, and the bluish edges here, the other thing that you'll notice is that there's quite a contrast in the tortoiseshell and the comma, a very pale outer edge and a darker inner, but with the peacock that contrast is much less. And the border here between the contrasted areas, pretty near straight, whereas here it's higgledy-piggledy, and here it's also quite bumpy. So small tortoiseshell possibly could be confused with the peacock, but you've got the blue and then this wavy border between it, a larger contrast. The speckled wood, again, you have got this paler area and a darker area, but you've got all these eye spots. So as I said at the beginning, it's very often a good idea to look at the edges of the wing, and we'd see blue, eye spots, nothing in this one and nothing in this one, but the contrast, I think, is a good clue. And of course, if you're looking at the edges, you can't really help but see that the comma's very wavy. Peacock, nothing like as distinctively marked, distinctively shaped, sorry. Okay, that was the end of that section, so I'm quite happy to take any questions you've got there, Roselle.
I don't think we've had any questions yet.
Hooray, that means I've taught it brilliantly. Let's carry on. Brimstone and clouded yellow. Now, you are unlikely to see a clouded yellow in your garden, but it does happen. You are incredibly likely to see a brimstone in your garden because they fly miles and miles and miles, the males seeking for females and the females looking for buckthorn, the plant on which they lay their eggs. So they're very, very peripatetic, these species, the brimstone. And the clouded yellow is certainly a long distance migrant, but it tends to be in chalk downland that you find it, or fields of lucerne, a very great favourite with this butterfly. It isn't really very fond of gardens. It does go through them, but it doesn't usually hang around very long. But just look at the wing edges, and we immediately spot differences. The wing edges, really pointy wingtips on the brimstone, and the clouded yellow, a nice smooth outline. So it should make it easy. In addition, when you see them fly, the brimstone looks lemon yellow, and I would say that the clouded yellow looks custard yellow. If you're close enough, you'll see that it's got a lot of black on the inside of the wing. This area here is black on the inside, but both the brimstone and clouded yellow always settle with their wings shut. You might also notice a white spot here on the clouded yellow and a black spot there, but the brimstone just has two brown spots. There's never a white centre as there is here. But I think just the overall shape makes it fairly easy. Now, this group, this is where you need to put your seatbelt on, folks, if you didn't, because this group can be tricky. The whites are the hardest of all, I think. Harder than the blues, harder than the fritillaries, my opinion. The small white here on the left has, luckily, as its name might suggest, small amounts of grey scales. And the large white, thank heavens, has large amounts of much darker scale. I'll just very quickly mention, this is a male with a single dot just there. Sometimes they also have a little bit of a black mark here, but the female has two black dots. So if this butterfly looked identical but with two black dots, it would be a female, and then it would almost certainly also have a black streak here. This female has two black dots and the beginning of a black streak, you can see, but this picture isn't very helpful, I'm sorry. Best I've got of a large white. But this large L shape, come on, use your imagination, that's an L shape. This large L shape of black means that this is a large white. And this very small grey patch, which doesn't come down this edge of the wing at all, is guaranteed a small white. Male one spot, female two spots. So the spots are not telling the species. I'm afraid a lot of identification guides, especially those which are printed and flogged or given away free, a lot of them have a picture of a small white with one spot and a large white with two, just like mine here, and people mistakenly look for the number of spots to tell the species, but that's the sex. The species is on the wing tips. Okay. Now the female brimstone is very much paler than the male. Instead of being lemon yellow, she's creamy white, and often by this time of the year, when she's already been flying for 10 months or so, she's very, very pale. So the female brimstone has got exactly the same pointy edges, but no black at all, anywhere. Even the green vein white, which, like the small white, tends to have grey markings, is more darkly marked. Now, I'm not going to tell you, because you're going to think to yourselves whether this is a male or a female. And to check it out, let's go back. A male with one spot and a female with two. So these are both female. The upper surface, this is the top side of the green vein white, always has these little pointy chevrons on the vein ends. So you can just about make out here. They're not very strongly marked in this particular individual, and green vein whites can be very pale in these areas, but there are always, at the edge here, some little chevrons or triangles, which is how you can tell that this is a green veined and not a small white, because the wing tip here is similar to a small white. I mean, you might be able to see in some specimens, they're very helpfully grey along the veins like this, but they're not all. Especially the male green vein whites can look a lot like a small white, but with always these chevrons showing here on the top surface. And if we look at the undersurface, the veins themselves have little grey flecks along them. It's called green veined white. It never looks very green to me. These always look grey on a yellow surface. The small white also has grey flecks, grey scales, but they're mostly here, look. There are none on the forewing, unlike in the green vein white, and this area has very few. Look at a large white, again, almost no grey flecks here, but look how that black shows through. That's a good clue. But on the hind wing, look, the grey is pretty much uniform. It isn't more in this area and less there. pretty much the same right across the whole hind wing. So small white, not necessarily smaller in size, by the way, the small white, which has a very pale forewing and some grey scales. Come on, mouse, where have you gone? Come on, there we are. Some grey scales on the lower half of the hind wing, and you might be able to see that yellowy mark there, which is actually the black showing through. The green veined white, where the grey scales are along the scales themselves, and the large white, where that large amount of black is showing through in an L shape, and the grey scales are more uniformly spread across the wing. They're not along the veins particularly, but they're on both halves of the hind wing. Now, this might be a point where we want to take some questions, Rizelle, because the whites are tricky.
I can't see if it, I don't think anyone's asked any questions. If they have, I can't see them.
Oh, right. Well, if anyone has asked a question, you'll need to unmute yourself, please, and say, I've asked a question, because we think you're not asking questions. I'll carry on, shall I, Rizelle?
Yes. Oh, hang on. Whoa, whoa, here they come. Okay, so we've got, somebody's asked a question I was going to ask, which is, how can we and how do we tell the difference between the whites when they're in flight?
Unless you're very lucky and a large white comes very close to you so you can see those obvious black L's on the wingtip, you can't. Simple as that, you just can't do it.
Okay, very good.
And it's really hard to accept that the whites are probably the least recorded of all the butterfly species by people who do butterfly surveys, because they fly and fly without stopping, apparently for miles, and they're damn near impossible to tell apart when they fly, unless they're, you know, within a couple of meters of you. You just can't see whether there's any pattern on the wings or not.
Okay, gosh, that's interesting. And a question from Susie. She would like to know, what's the difference in size between large white, small white, and green veined white?
I'm sorry, Susie, it's a similarly unfortunate answer. You can have large whites as small whites. Small whites and green veined whites are about the same size, which is usually to be about 3/4 the size of a large white. So large whites are usually bigger, but unfortunately that isn't a good way to tell them apart. And it's more helpful actually if you see what you consider to be a large white, a large whitish coloured butterfly, to look at the wing tips to see if it's actually a female brimstone. If you can see the pointy wingtips, it's a female brimstone, and if you can't, and you can't see any black either, then you just have to put it down as a, oh, it was a white butterfly, but I've got no idea what it was. Sorry.
Okay, and just finally, can you clarify the difference between the small white and the green veined white?
Yes. Let's go back on the screen here to the small white. Notice the wings are completely plain apart from either 1 or 2 black dots here and possibly a black streak there, with a very small amount of grey, just a smudge at the wingtip. And if we go to the green vein white, the female, the 2 dots and this black line here, but look at the wing veins. They are marked by grey scales, both on the upper surface and the undersurface. So the green veined white, I personally identify the males, which can be tricky, by looking for little chevrons just here. The veins are always more darkly marked right at the edges. So there's always something there. Even if this area looks like a small white, this area will have some grey marks and there's nothing in the same area on a small white. Let's look at it. Here we are, look, completely plain. But if you could see some little grey triangles here, then that would be a green veined white. Slightly easier on the underside because usually the underside is more strongly marked with these veins, and the small white just has some grey dusting sort of randomly. You can see they're not along the veins, they're just in the spaces between them. And the same with the large white, where it's over the whole of the wing surface and not just the basal half. So hopefully that's cleared that up, but by all means come back to these pictures repeatedly, because I know the whites are really difficult, and unfortunately there's nothing you can do except practice. It does get easier with practice, but it's not possible to identify every white that you see. It's probably possible to identify about 30%, because they tend to fly past without stopping. Sad but true, I'm afraid.
Okay, that's brilliant, Nick. Thanks.
Okay, let's move on. A very colourful and fantastic, vivacious little butterfly, the small copper. If you get this in your garden regularly, brilliant. And it either means you've got a lovely garden with lots of wild flowers, including sorrel, that you haven't pulled out because it's a weed. Please don't pull out weeds. Or you live next door to someone else who's got a garden where they haven't pulled out all the weeds. Possibly you live next door to a farmer's field and he's got some nice margins. But this is a beautiful little butterfly, and you shouldn't really confuse it with anything else because of the orange and the black. So orange, black, orange, black. Nothing else has a black hind wing like this and an orange forewing. But if you were to see the small copper perched, you might just conceivably think, oh, was it a small heath? Because that's got a similar hind wing look. Small heath are less common in gardens, but it could happen this year because they're having an absolutely fantastic year. They're all over the place. So you might see one in your garden if you have grass in your garden and you don't mow it. And why would you? Because you know that insects need long grass, so you wouldn't be doing that. So in the longer grass areas, or possibly the short grass areas next to the long grass areas of your garden, you might see small heath. It always settles with its wings shut, but look at the difference here. A pale outer area, a dark central area, and a white streak, well, very pale streak between them. The small copper has the same orange, not as colourful, but the same orange on the wing edge. Wing edges are so important. And then a uniform grey inside. So a difference in the small heath, uniform in the small copper. A pale area in the small heath and an orange on the small copper. But if you see a small copper, you'll tend to know by its behaviour. It darts about rapidly. The small heath is a much floppier, slower flyer, not as engaging, I'm afraid. Its personality is a bit dull. It's the sort of person who sits around in a corner at a party, whereas the small copper's zipping about and engaging with everybody, and can be quite pugnacious, the small copper, if upset. So if a bee dares to come near its favourite perch, it would chase it off, and so on. Now, equally orangish and zipping about, roughly the same size, is the large skipper, shown here. This is a male. It has a black mark here. The female looks pretty much identical, but without this black mark. So large skipper on this side, the left-hand side. I put the silver spotted skipper in, not because I think you'll see it in your garden. I think that is incredibly unlikely, but people sometimes see large skippers with much paler markings than this. Sometimes the markings in this top triangle area of the wing here are so faint that it doesn't really look any different, apart from being orangey there and slightly darker here. You can't see these marks, they're very faint, but occasionally they're really quite bright, and they might make you think, oh, it's a silver spotted skipper. But these are much bigger and much more contrasted. Plus, the whole of the wing look tends to grade from orangey here to darker. There isn't that sudden contrasted edge. And the underside are very definitely different. the underside of the large skipper, you can hardly see those pale spots. They are there, but you have to look very closely. The underside of the silver spotted skipper, they're really obvious. And this area just here, look, which is pretty much green on a large skipper, has got this little circle of 4 joined together there, those two, but 4 spots which are really obvious. You never get that on a large skipper. So if you see that ring of spots there, we're away from the wing edges, just breaking my my rule here, but that ring of spots there confirms silver spotted skipper. Some fairly bright spots here, do not confirm silver spotted, because occasionally you get a very pale large skipper where these spots do stand out, but they're nothing like as bright as this. So I thought I'd better clear that one up. Anyway, the large skipper zips around the garden, just like the small copper that we just looked at. But if we go back to the small copper, look at the difference between the orange and the black, and uniformly orange for the large skipper. Both wings, top and bottom, we can't see the bottom because of the way they sit, very strange way they sit. But it would look like this, orange on both wings. Now, we are going to struggle, I'm afraid, when you see these in your garden, assuming you haven't mowed your grass to death, you are going to see small skipper and Essex skipper in your garden. And the small skipper, people always say, you can tell because it has orange underneath the antenna, don't look at the tops, and the Essex black underneath, which is true, but I think it's a good idea to look at the whole of the antennal shaft. If you can get to see the underneath, I must stress that because the top side isn't any help to you. The underneath, the small skipper gradually gets darker and darker and darker, and sometimes these tips can be very dark, but it's a gradual change along the shaft of the antenna with a small skipper to a usually orange but occasionally very dark tip. The Essex skipper is much paler all the way along, and then a very dark tip at the edge. If you can't see the underside of these marks here, the only other way you can tell them apart, and I'm not sure if I've got it in the next slide, but I think I have, is by looking to see if it's a male. Yes, I have. And the male small skipper, this is unfortunate, the small skipper has a larger scent brand just here. The male only, the female will be completely clear. The females are very hard to tell apart. So the male has this long scent brand, and the Essex skipper has a much shorter one. So it'd be helpful if the small skipper had a small one, wouldn't it? But I'm afraid nature doesn't work that way. It hasn't designed itself just for our benefit, sadly. Sometimes, but please don't use this as a rule that always works, if you look at the tip of the wing, you can see that a grey-green triangle here in the wingtip, that indicates small skipper, whereas the Essex skipper, I'm sorry, you can't see it on this picture. Could we see it on the one before? Yes. The orange tends to go all the way to the wingtip without a grey-green a different area. You can just about see it there, look. But it's a slightly different colour. So the Essex skipper, the shaft of the antenna is pretty much the same colour all the way, and then suddenly there's a striking inky black tip. And on the underside of the wing, the colour, sort of straw colour, goes all the way to the tips, usually. And on the small skipper, you've got a gradually darkening, deepening colour until it becomes quite dark, often orange. And here you often get a greenish colour right on the wingtip, greenish grey, but that isn't always the case. The antenna is a clincher. Now, one thing that I ought to stress at this point, the large skipper, go back to it, can you see here? It's got black tips as well, and the silver spotted, but we're not going to be worrying about that too much. So just because a butterfly has black tips to its antenna and it is a skipper, doesn't make it an Essex. So you've got to look to see if it's got a plain surface with no spotting at all and a sudden contrast. And you'll also notice that these antennal tips are very blunt. I can't see it in this picture because of the angle we've taken it. You can just about see it there. Maybe you can get this downloaded and enlarge that, but it comes to a very fine point. The large skipper has a very fine point right at the end of the antenna. The silver spotted doesn't. But anyway, they're black, which is the problem, because that's how you tell the Essex from the small. So you've got to be first of all certain it's an Essex or a small, and then sort it out by the antenna tips. Maybe a good time to break the cell, because possibly people have got questions, although I have repeated that endlessly, so they're probably bored and want to move on.
I can't see any questions about
Okay.
the skipper. There was just one question that came in about the whites after we'd moved on, and
Yes.
that was which of those whites is known as the cabbage white?
Unfortunately, two of them, in fact probably all three, but the large white and the small white both have caterpillars that eat cabbage, and the green vein white rarely eats cabbage but can. So usually people say cabbage white referring to the large white or the small white, but just occasionally people will moan about green vein white on their cabbage because it can happen. It doesn't usually, but it can.
Okay.
Moving on, or are we now getting questions?
No, we've now got some skipper questions coming in.
Yay.
Is there any way of telling the different skippers apart when they're in flight?
Not really. You might, if you're lucky, see a large skipper and be able to see the contrast, because there is a contrast here. And the Essex skipper and the small skipper are just completely orange. So you might be able to see that, but I think you'd be very lucky if the butterfly was sufficiently obliging that it flew past you slowly enough. They're called skippers. I like the Turkish name for the skipper family, which is zippy zippy, and that's exactly what they are. They whiz around very close to the ground and they have a whirring wing beat, which makes it really hard to see. So in flight, tricky, I'm afraid. Possible if you're lucky, but usually you have to wait for it to settle. One good thing, it's the males that you'll tend to see most often, because they're the ones that are constantly hunting about the females, and they do tend to go back to the same perch. So if you scare one off from a position, if you just stand and wait patiently, it will probably come back very close to where you scared it from. So step back a meter from where you scared it and wait for it to come back.
Okay, and you also mentioned that if you stand a better chance of seeing them in your garden if you don't mow your lawn.
Yep.
Why is that? Are they feeding on something?
A good question. I didn't explain that at all. Well, did I? Didn't explain it at all. The large skipper, the silver spotted skipper, and the small heath, the large skipper, the silver spotted skipper, the small and the Essex, their caterpillars eat grass, but they can't feed on a lawn that's been mown. They can only feed on grasses which grow to have long flower stalks, because the eggs are laid into the flower stalks. So the stems that grow up with flowers at the top, or the stems that grow up with grass leaves coming out from them alternately are opposite around the sides of that stem, that's where the females will lay their eggs. So if your grass is mown, they will fly across it and keep going until they find somewhere that suits them as a place where they can breed. So it's a good idea to have long grass, because it allows them to breed, and you will get them breeding in the garden without any trouble at all, as long as you leave some longish grass in the sun. Moving on.
And when, so if that's the case,
Yeah.
when do the eggs hatch and the larvae emerge, and then when do they metamorphose? Do you need to leave that long grass throughout the winter?
It's a good idea to leave some. The caterpillars I hope I've got this the right way around, I think I have. The caterpillar of the small and the large skipper will emerge from their eggs later on in the summer, and they will do some feeding and then go through the winter hiding as a caterpillar somewhere in the base of the grass, but not right down at the bottom, as most of the browns do. We haven't got to them yet. The Essex skipper will hatch out of its egg, but it immediately hibernates, which seems a very strange strategy. It doesn't feed on the grass at all. And that will tend to be higher up the stem, because that's where the egg was laid. So if you mow the grass, even in October, November, you could get rid of your Essex skippers. So it's a good idea to leave an area of long grass right through the winter and cut it alternate years, something like that, and change the area that you mow. If that's too complicated, then at least don't cut it too short. So leave an area that is relatively long all the time. I've only got a small garden, but I try to leave some areas uncut and different areas each year, only small patches, but it must work because I do get all these butterflies in the garden every year.
Oh, that's really interesting. Great, thank you. I think that's all the questions so far on skippers.
Okay, well, we're cracking on. We must be halfway through, I think. Let's keep going. The browns, not the most colourful of the species, but absolutely lovely to see them because they're present in such numbers. The meadow brown is the commonest butterfly in Britain, so it's the wren of the butterfly world, and you'll see it everywhere across the British Isles. The meadow brown, this is a female, by the way, because it's slightly paler. This area here is larger in the female, this pale yellow area. That's the meadow brown, and this is the ringlet. Now you'd look at these two and you think, well, they're easy to tell apart, but when they fly, they look very similar. The ringlet is darker, and as you get to see a few ringlets, nice fresh ones, when they start flying in about 10 days' time perhaps, you will notice that they are darker than the meadow browns, but there isn't much in it. So as they get warm later in the year, in July, they can be approximately in flight the same colour as meadow browns, and you might need to wait for them to settle to see the difference. But one thing on a nice fresh specimen that is definitely true, the edge of the meadow brown is a sort of greyish colour, hardly any different in tone from the edge inside. This is known as the margin here. And it's about the same colour as this very, very marginal tuft of pale hairs. But the ringlet, there is a really obvious difference. The ringlet appears to have white margins here against a black line, which you can probably see, and then the ground colour of this dark chocolate colour. So that's a good clue. If you can see a really stark difference, sometimes you can actually see that in flight. You can see that white edge contrasted. But obviously it's much easier when they settle, because the meadow brown has a black spot, eye spot with a single white pupil. I'll just quickly mention that the gatekeeper, which shouldn't be flying yet, that's a July and August butterfly, but it's already out because we're having an absolutely crazy summer. The gatekeeper looks similar to this, but it has two white spots. Where's my mouse gone? There it is. Two white spots, two white pupils here, but it's also much more orange. I think we'll assume most of you are not going to see a gatekeeper just yet. Meadow brown and ringlet you'll see first. Look at the number of spots on a ringlet compared. One on a meadow brown, many on a ringlet. And it's these creamy coloured rings, which someone described as being halos the other day, and I thought that was rather nice. So the ringlet's got little creamy halos, and lots of them. The meadow brown's got a single eye, like a cyclops. The small heath has the same single eye, but you know we've already discussed that it has a dark area and a pale area and an even paler area just here, which isn't very obvious on this specimen, is it? But look how the area, this pale area on the back of the wing merges pretty much the same grey right the way to the very edge of the margins. And there is a difference here, and a more striking difference there. This small heath, by the way, is about half the size of these two. It really is small. For once, the name small works. The meadow brown and the ringlet can both sit with their wings open. The small heath never does. And we already looked at the speckled wood, just to point out it does have multiple eyes. But I think the obvious difference in the ridges of the veins and the fact that you've got this fairly varied background here. You've got areas of light and areas of dark, whereas with the ringlet, the whole thing is constantly the same colour. Uniformly, I think that's a better word, uniformly the same colour. Okay, let's move on. So the top surface of a male meadow brown has less pale colour, as I said. The female, go back to it, more pale. The male, less pale colour. And a hint here of a dark scent brand. The male ringlet, the halos around the eye spots are less obvious, but they are still there. And we can see how this white contrasts with the ground colour, and this is a sort of greyer colour which doesn't contrast so obviously. I think those two, when they're settled and you get a good look, are easy because of the multiple eyes on a ringlet. The speckled wood, as I've just mentioned, just go through it again quickly, does have lots of eyes, but very different. Lots and lots of pale, creamy coloured patches, perhaps straw yellow patches on a dark background. And there's one more brown butterfly, oddly. This is a member of the brown family, but it's evolved to be strikingly black and white. And the striking black and white pattern should mean that you can identify this without any trouble at all, unless you hadn't already learnt that the green veined white has grey veins. But you can see that this isn't a pattern that goes along the veins. This is a pattern which is in bands around the butterfly. So a very different appearance. Okay, shall we take questions on the browns, please, Roselle?
I'm not sure. I don't think we've got any.
Okay, right, we'll plough on. Stay in there, folks, because we've not got many more now. Okay, in your garden, you are going to see, I think every garden in Britain gets both these blues. Maybe if you live right in the middle of London, you don't get them very often, but both these butterflies are in your garden. And the one that you'll see most often actually is not the common blue, but the holly. The holly blue is, I think the technical term, polyphagous. It can lay its eggs and the caterpillars can feed on a whole variety of different flowering shrubs. So if you've got any flowering shrubs in your garden, the holly blue will try, won't always succeed, but the caterpillars will try and eat the developing berries and fruit. So the flowers are laid by the female holly blue into the flower buds, and the caterpillars eat whatever develops. The common blue needs plants like bird's foot trefoil and hot trefoil, black medic, 1 or 2 plants of that type. It can feed on a few other vetches as well, but they are less common, unfortunately, in people's gardens than flowering plants, flowering shrubs. So the holly blue is commoner, and we can tell them apart. Wing edges, folks. Look at this wing edge. Can you see the black and white checker there? And this wing edge, the common blue is completely clear. And that's really important to remember. So the white margin on a common blue is completely clear. But the holly blue always has checkered fringes. Strangely and uniquely, only checkered fringes on the forewing. The hind wing's clear like the common blue. The holly blue is also peculiar in being Britain's only entirely blue butterfly, in the sense that both the male and the female are blue. The other blue butterflies have a blue male, like the common blue male here, but the female is brown. We'll come to that in a moment. I'll just mention the difference that you will see it will already have spotted without me mentioning it, that the common blue underside has a row of orange, not often, occasionally red, usually orange lunules, those little triangles there, look. And the holly blue is white, but without lunules, nothing at all, white and black. These black dots, as you might call them, are actually streaks. Can you see their little streaks? These are pupils, black pupils inside little white eyes, quite different. No white eyes at all here, no eyes at all, just black streaks on a white background, no red lunules. So they really are very simple to tell apart. Now the holly blue does look a lot like a small blue, but you're incredibly unlikely to have small blue in your garden unless you've deliberately planted kidney vetch, the food plant of its caterpillar. The small blue, not only small, but also look, it has got blobs and not streaks. It has a clear margin and it's got these white rings around the black dots. No white rings in the holly blue and a checkered margin. But probably the biggest giveaway if you see a small blue is that they're not blue. I know that sounds crazy, but the small blue is this sort of slate grey colour. There might be a few flecks of blue, but there is not a lot of blue in a small blue. Holly blue, male and female, are blue. Now I mentioned that the common blue, female, is brown. Here we are, look, common blue, female, almost all brown. There is a hint of blue. Now you can see female common blues where there is no blue at all, but it's always quite different from the striking appearance of the brown argus, which is a blue butterfly, which, like the small blue, isn't blue at all. I expect you can see there that this is a brown butterfly with red lunules. This is a brown butterfly with orangey lunules, and the male and the female brown argus look like this. Now, I always think it's a really easy thing to spot. If this butterfly, if you see a butterfly and you're not sure which of these two it is, but if the butterfly is chasing other butterflies, not being chased, but chasing, actively going out and pursuing other butterflies, then it's a male. And a female common blue wouldn't do that, so it must be a brown argus. Now this is a female brown argus, but the male brown argus looks identical. It has little black bars, you can just see them I hope, going through the wing margins. So if you're not absolutely sure because you've not seen it chasing anything, look for the wing margins. There are black bands just visible. The common blue, clear, completely clear white margins. So hopefully common and clear. The brown argus broken by these little black vein extensions, just like the holly blue was. Okay, now if you see them settled, the undersides have also got some differences. So the brown argus underside, these tend to be redder, less orange. These are more orange, but the colours can be, as you can see here, very similar. The brown argus has a figure of 8 just here. Some people say it's a colon. The common blue has those two same spots here, look, separated and in a smooth sort of question mark shape. If you want to tell me that that's been mirror imaged, okay, but it's a sort of a question mark, isn't it? Oh, blimey, sorry. Whereas here, that question mark, this spot should be up there somewhere, shouldn't it? Been pulled down into a sort of question, a colon. And here, the brown argus has a bare area, alliteration again. The brown argus has a bare area where the common blue has this additional spot. So the common blue with its clear border, and the brown Argus, you can see the veins going through. Look, I know it's not very obvious in this picture. I'm afraid this is the one slide that I downloaded from somebody else's pictures, and although this was my picture I provided and they did the comparison for me, I've taken this back from them, and contrast isn't brilliant here, is it? But you can see those veins going through the white border. So the brown Argus has a broken margin, it's got a colon here and a bare area. The common blue has a clear border, it's got a question mark, and it's got a dot here where the brown Argus has none. So the undersides should be easy as a way of telling them apart, but it always helps, of course, if you see a male common blue, because it's blue, and that makes it a bit easy, seeing as the brown Argus is brown. Occasionally people tell us that they see Adonis blue in their garden. Now this is incredibly unlikely because it's restricted to areas where there is horseshoe vetch growing in incredibly short turf. You might have a garden, lucky you, with horseshoe vetch growing in very short turf. I don't mean mowed, I mean it just never grows very much because the soil is so poor. In which case you might see Adonis blue. But our refrain about the wing edges, look at the clear border in the common blue and the broken border here with black veins extending through in the Adonis. And you might also notice the colour. If anyone says to you, and I often hear this, I think I saw an Adonis, they probably didn't. If they're jumping up and down and can hardly contain themselves, and they say, I've just seen an Adonis, it was the most amazing blue I've ever seen, it was electric, they probably have. There is an incredible difference between the colours. But Adonis blues can fade, and common blues, when they're fresh, can be very bright. So look for the borders. Common blue, clear border. Okay. And the undersides, unfortunately, are really similar. I would suggest you do not try to tell common blue from Adonis blue from the undersides. If you want to read various bits of text online, you'll find that some people say you can tell them by various things like the lunules here and the way that the amount of white in those lunules appears inside little circles here, look. But it's a bit tricky and you need to get a very good view. Photographs might work, but try and use the ground colour and the margins, because there are veins going through the white margin on the Adonis blue. Okay, we better stop there. We're on to the last little bit after that, which will be very quick.
Okay, there was just there was one question about distinguishing between a male and the female in the holly blue. Could you just?
Okay, yeah, sure. We'll go back to the picture.
Yeah, thank you.
So this is a male holly blue. If it was a female holly blue, it would have a dark black triangle here. So the only difference between the male and female holly blue is that it's got a lot more black in this wingtip. A very narrow band of black there in the male, but a wider band in the female, almost a triangle here. But otherwise they are identical in terms of their blueness.
Okay, and then there was one question also about walls and gatekeepers. Are they around? Wall?
Yep, okay.
Yeah. Are they around at the same time? Do we need to worry about getting them muddled up, or is it?
If you live in Oxfordshire, and I'm assuming most of your participants do, you're not going to see a wall, I'm afraid. We managed to somehow get rid of all them. Nobody really knows what went wrong for the wall, but it's vanished completely from Oxfordshire. So almost impossible to see a wall in Oxfordshire unless somebody has bred some and released them. And the gatekeeper, very orange, but I thought I'd do that. We go back to the meadow brown. The gatekeeper would be really orange here, really orange. I mean, it's strikingly orange. It's not just slightly orange like this male, or a, you can see here, this is paler, a bit orange. It's this colour orange like the small heath, but in this area. I'll do that. If I do an update for the July butterflies, I'll deal with the gatekeeper then, because although they are flying already in at least one county of Britain, they don't normally appear till July. And I think this cold weather this coming week means not many of us are going to see a gatekeeper for at least a fortnight. So I haven't included a slide of that.
Okay, that's really interesting. Brilliant. Thanks.
Okay, so I'll just very quickly make a plug for recording. It's so important that people tell us what they see. In your gardens, it gives us a great idea of what's going on across the country. And we quite often pick up on rare things which are in an area because somebody says, I saw so-and-so in my garden. And when we check it out, we find that close by there's a place where that rare butterfly has been breeding undisturbed. And the fact that one flew into their garden is a great clue. I would strongly urge all those people, and you're using Zoom, so you must be at least a bit competent with computers. I'd urge people to think about getting this free I Record Butterflies app onto your smartphone. You can get it from Google or the Apple Store and stick it on there. You'll get, first of all, it will tell you it's loading, as this one is. And when you've pressed on it and got it loaded, you'll see this screen. And if you wished, you could look at the ID Recorder Butterfly, which is obviously if you just see a single butterfly, or if you want to check whether you've identified it properly. I'll come back to that. But surveying an area is very useful. I use it all the time in my garden, and I click on it, and then it allows me to put in the name of where I am. Don't put my garden, please, because nobody will know where your garden is. Or sometimes people put in my street, which isn't any more helpful. So the name of a town or a village is better. You could, if you want, give a postcode. And you can add that to your site favorite, so you don't have to add it in every time. By just clicking that, you go straight in there. And then you choose whether you're going to do a point location, standing still in your garden, what you can see, or whether you're going to go for a walk and record what you see, or you could do a really long walk, look, a whole kilometre square. And when you've asked it to get my location, it will show you it's got your location and give you a little map to show you where it thinks, or beg your pardon, where you are. And you click use this location, and it immediately jumps to this page where you add species. And the brilliant thing about this app is it suggests what's most likely in your area on that day. So it changes depending on where you live and which day of the year it is. It suggests the species which are most likely at the top of a list. So you can scroll down the list here, and you can go by using your finger to flick the list up to whichever species you've seen. You just click on the picture of the butterfly or the plus, and it will increase the number that you've seen, and eventually you can send this away. So you create a list of what you've seen in your garden. This is obviously somebody in the spring. They'd seen a small tortoiseshell, a small white, they'd click them all, first of all, in add species, and then they click send, and that goes whizzing off to the UK BMS and gets included in the data that we send to government about the way butterflies are getting on. Really very handy. If you decide that you're not quite sure about the idea of a butterfly, you can check. So you can look through. Now, we had a question, didn't we, about green vein white? So somebody might see one and not be absolutely sure. You click on any of these pictures in the guide, and it brings up loads of extra information. So you could have a map showing you where it's likely that you'd see it. You can read these tips here, and if you want, you can go to further information and put up even more information about it, including pictures of the top surface and undersurface and so on in the gallery there. So loads of information, a really useful app, completely free, and I strongly urge people to use it. One more thing you can do, if you don't like using smartphones, you could go to the Butterflies for the New Millennium, which is part of butterfly conservation, and you could use this for recording butterflies in your garden. Now, I'm not quite sure why they've chosen to put a checkered skipper there, because we don't get them in gardens, but anyway, this app will allow you to capture, by entering it on your PC, data into a spreadsheet to go off to exactly the same place. It's, in my opinion, slightly more difficult to use than the smartphone app, because you need to tell it where you live and find your place on a map that comes up. You have to find it and put a little pin into the map. but otherwise it's very similar, works in a very similar way. And then finally, my last point before any questions is that if you like recording all sorts of things, and who doesn't, if you download equally free iRecord, the iRecord Butterflies that I just promoted is a subsection of this, actually, a slimmed down and easy to use version. This is a massive program, and you can record anything that you see in your garden on here. But you have to know what you're looking at. That's the problem with this, because it will ask you, what did you see? And when you start to type in the name of what you saw, it comes up with the information about it, and you can say, yes, that's it. Unfortunately, if you just know, well, I saw a dragonfly, but I'm not sure which one, it isn't much help, because it doesn't get you close to the right identification. It gets you distantly from it by giving you all the dragonflies and damselflies, for instance, but it's not quite as useful in the sense that it's trying to cover so many things, all the plants, all the insects, all the mammals, all the birds, everything. But it's a brilliant program, and I'd recommend people consider using it. Okay, I'll stop talking. Everybody will be glad to hear. And Roselle, you can tell me if you've got any more questions.
Well, no, I'm not sure we do, although they do seem to come in fits and
In
bursts.
chunks, yes, when I stop talking.
Oh, okay. But what I would say is that I've become absolutely obsessed with iRecord Butterflies over the last, well, since, you know, over the last few months, and it is, it's quite the most perfect app. It's got great photos, and the gallery is really good if you think you've got the species, and you just want to double check. The gallery is fantastic. It's got loads of different shots from different angles just to help you confirm. So yeah, it's a great, it's almost like a great introduction to iRecord, really.
Yes, absolutely.
There's lots of nice comments, thank you so much. And Sarah is leaving us now because she's got to go do something else.
Well, I think we're finished, so you're not really leaving us, Sarah. We're at the end.